Hello and welcome back to the Reading Heart. Since my last essay on antinatalism that I shared, that was my first video, I have discussed this topic with various people and got a bit of critique in. And yeah, one critique point stuck with me that has to do with the ultimate rationality or the ultimate thing that comes out of the logic of antinatalism if you follow it to the end. So I wrote another short essay on that, and that kind of critiques antinatalism or looks at this issue that I also wanted to share with you. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you want a detailed description of antinatalism first, please watch the first video. Let's start with the essay. What is antinatalism and how it is argued for? So this will be a short summary of the arguments for antinatalism. Antinatalism is the philosophical position that it is fundamentally immoral to bring children into the world. The main argument for this position is the argument from consent. A child cannot consent to being born, and because a child will always experience some amount of pain that they did not consent to, it is therefore immoral to make that choice for them and bring them into the world. It then further argues, since the child has no desire to be born and no desire to experience anything at all before coming into existence, the suffering they do not experience is good, while the pleasure they do not experience is merely neutral, since it can only be considered bad if there is someone to miss out on it, which is not the case here. The fundamental argument. To summarize the underlying argumentation that this argument rests upon, we have to set a few ground values on which it rests. We can then follow these fundamental values to its logical conclusion to see where it leads. I'll be trying to see this from a perspective of an ultimately rational being and try not to rely on any kind of moral feeling or anything else, but only follow rational logic. The first assumption that we have to make is that suffering on its own is bad. We can just accept this for now, for the sake of argument, and we will turn to it later. After we have now established suffering as a fundamentally morally bad value, it then argues further that by bringing someone into the world, you are inflicting suffering on them without their consent and purely for your own good, since the child has no desire to come into the world, therefore making procreation a necessarily selfish act. So the essence that we can extract from this perspective is that inflicting suffering on someone else without their consent is a bad thing. So the essence that we can extract from this perspective is that inflicting suffering on someone else without their consent is a bad thing. So now we have a broader value that we can follow. Of course, we have to assume that this also now applies in all situations involving suffering. As a first consequence of this, many antinatalists, to be morally consistent, become vegans, so as to not inflict suffering on unborn animals that would have to be brought into the world and suffer for the antinatalists to eat them. So, in this example, we can see that at least most antinatalists apply their fundamental moral worldview, as described above, on their day-to-day lives in order to be morally consistent. What does it lead to? If we want to apply this worldview consistently, we have to argue that suffering inflicted by you on another person without their consent is immoral. But not only that. To address the issue of a subjective experience, namely that most people are glad to have been born, and the argument that there are lives in which there is more pleasure than suffering, antinatalists argue that the risk of a life containing more suffering than pleasure is enough of a justification to not bring this life into existence. That is also why antinatalism isn't an inherently pessimistic philosophy. Rather than saying that every life necessarily contains more suffering than pleasure, antinatalists instead argue that the possibility of such an outcome is enough to make it immoral to bring a life into existence. If we want to stay consistent with this worldview, we now have to apply this chain of logic to every situation in life itself. And there, the fundamental problem with the value system and argumentation comes into focus. We, as in existing human beings, are always causing harm in some capacity to one another. And since we cannot be sure that we will bring more pleasure to others than suffering, we are now faced with a moral dilemma. The antinatalists argue that the risk of inflicting more suffering than pleasure on someone else without their consent is essentially an immoral action. Since we, in our everyday existence, are always inflicting at least some amount of suffering on others, and therefore taking the risk of causing more suffering than pleasure without their consent through our actions only for our own good, it would therefore follow that the only moral action is to commit suicide, since we cannot bear the risk of inflicting more suffering than pleasure on others. And according to this line of reasoning, the risk is not worth the pleasure that we may potentially experience at someone else's expense by staying alive, just as it is not worth the risk of bringing another child into existence simply for the potential pleasure of the parents that are creating that child. Is suffering actually bad? From a purely rational perspective, as I said I will be trying to argue for here, the first premise that suffering is inherently bad does not necessarily follow. Since there's no inherent quality or law to the universe that makes suffering bad, this value cannot be derived from pure reason alone. In general, terms like good or bad are not products of purely rational thought. They are evaluations that we assign based on subjective experience and preferences. An experience that one person might view as good, another person might view as bad. Of course, there are actions that are widely regarded as bad, such as murder, but even these judgments ultimately rely on underlying values. There are also people who view suffering in certain contexts as valuable or even desirable, such as masochist. If we ask why suffering is bad, we eventually reach a point where we cannot provide a purely rational justification. The reasoning usually becomes something like, suffering is bad because suffering is bad, or suffering is bad because I experience it as negative. However, this is not a universal fact, but rather a value that arises from conscious experience. Therefore, if we attempt to view the world from a perspective of pure reason alone, we cannot assign inherent value to anything, whether positive or negative. There is no objective standard within the universe that gives things meaning or moral value. Instead, values arise from perspectives, experiences, and preferences of conscious beings. If we follow this line of reasoning to its conclusion, a purely rational perspective, stripped of all its assumptions about value, leads to a form of nihilism. However, this is not a practically applicable position because a human being without any values, desires, or preferences would have no motivation at all to act. Even the decision to value rationality itself cannot be justified through pure reason alone, because it already assumes that rationality is something worth valuing. This leaves us with an interesting conclusion. If logic and rationality alone cannot create meaning or moral value, then every value system must ultimately begin with some fundamental assumption that cannot be proven through pure reason. These values are not discovered as objective properties of the universe, but are instead assigned by conscious beings. State laws, in this view, reflect the values and beliefs of societies that create them. They are not necessarily expressions of objective moral truths, but rather the result of collective human judgments about what should be considered right or wrong. A statement like, "murder is wrong," can therefore then be understood as an expression of a morally evaluation based on certain underlying values, such as the desire to prevent suffering or protect human well-being. If someone is then asked why murder is wrong, they may answer because it causes suffering. However, as explained earlier, The statement that suffering itself is morally wrong cannot be described through pure reason alone. It ultimately depends on the value system that one chooses to adopt. Therefore, we can ultimately conclude that every value assigned to anything cannot be derived from pure reason alone, but must originate from some fundamental standpoint beyond pure reasoning. Consequently, from this perspective of pure reason stopped of all its assumptions, no action can be considered inherently more right or wrong or good or bad than any other, because all moral evaluations depend on values that are inherently non-rational. A statement like murder is wrong then becomes little more than a statement like I don't like murder. These are fundamentally the same statements, since they are both subjective moral evaluations and evaluations in general. To get back to the point of antinatalism, if we assume that for this argument that suffering is inherently bad, or that we view suffering as bad, even with this assumption, as shown above, we cannot follow this line of reasoning to its conclusion, or we have to kill ourselves. Even within this moral framework of suffering is bad, we have to make another illogical leap somewhere along the chain. For some, it is that they simply don't kill oneself to prevent more suffering. For some, it is that they don't want to become vegan to prevent more suffering. And for some, it may be that they don't want to give away the pleasure of having children to prevent more suffering. Even within this moral framework of suffering is bad, since we have to make another illogical leap somewhere along the chain, one illogical leap cannot be considered more wrong than any other. This becomes a problem at the heart of antinatalism. And this was it. Thank you very much. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Maybe I have made some errors in my reasoning. I would love to know if you see some problems with that. Thank you very much. Goodbye.